statement by the Vice President of the Commission, High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Situation in Kashmir. And I'll give the floor to Minister Tuppurainen, who speaks on behalf of the Vice President. Minister Tuppurainen, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, honourable members, the tensions in the region have increased following the announcement by the Indian government on 5 August of the revocation Article 370 that grants a partial autonomy to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. This step has been accompanied by restrictions of fundamental rights and freedoms. The Indian government has deployed a significant number of additional military and paramilitary troops in Kashmir and along the line of control. The action was presented by the Indian government as a means to prevent violent protests. Pakistan has also deployed additional troops on its side of the line of control. On both sides, the issue of Kashmir resonates strongly with internal political dynamics. While some of the restrictions are reportedly lifted, the situation has not returned to normalcy. There have been arrests of political leaders, activists and human rights defenders. The European Union has been following the situation closely since the early days of this escalation of tensions. In early August, High Representative Mogherini spoke on the phone with both of her Pakistani and Indian counterparts. In both conversations, the High Representative underlined the importance of avoiding a further escalation and stressed that dialogue between India and Pakistan through diplomatic channels is crucial. Our position on Kashmir remains unchanged. We encourage India and Pakistan to seek a peaceful and political solution, respectful of the interests of the Kashmiri population on both sides of the line of control. This remains the only way to solve a long-lasting dispute that for too long has caused instability and insecurity in the region. We remain concerned about the situation on the ground with its restrictions on fundamental freedoms. It is crucial that freedom of movement and means of communication are fully restored, as well as access to all essential services. The High Representative conveyed these concerns to the Indian Minister for External Affairs, Jaishankar, during their meeting in Brussels on 13 August. The Minister debriefed the High Representative on the state of play and on the security situation. Mrs. Mogherini reiterated the call to avoid an escalation of tensions and stressed the importance of steps to restore the rights and freedoms of the population in Kashmir. The EU has also raised the situation in Jammu and Kashmir at the Human Rights Council meeting in Geneva in an Item 2 statement on 10 September. In the statement, we encouraged the lifting of the remaining restrictions temporarily imposed and to maintain the rights and fundamental freedoms of the affected population. We continue to urge both parties to engage in direct dialogue with a view to a peaceful solution in full respect of their international human rights obligations. In a moment of rising tensions in different regions around the world, no one could afford another escalation in Kashmir. Regional cooperation in South Asia is now more essential than ever, and we will continue to encourage India and Pakistan to resume dialogue and find a peaceful solution for their disputes. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister Tuppurainen. We follow with statements by political groups. On behalf of the group of the European People's Party, Christian Democrats, Mr. Băsescu, 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. Minister. The situation in Kashmir is categorically alarming, and I would say unacceptable too. The constant trampling of human rights, street violence, political clashes, and above all, 2 nuclear powers head-to-head in conflict. These are the parameters in which matters are developing in Kashmir, without, at this time, there being any hope of a swift solution. I've taken note of the position that the rotating presidency of the EU has taken. I think it's smart and efficient. However, I would like to make an observation as regards us as Europeans. In this session, we have discussed Hong Kong, Amazon forest fires, Burkina Faso, the situation in Colombia, and the situation in Kashmir. But we're not discussing our problems, which sometimes are pretty difficult to resolve. And often these problems cause dissatisfaction amongst EU citizens. I'm thinking of the security and inviolability of EU borders, or the migration for which we haven't given the 500 million citizens an answer, or the terrorist risk, or the lack of cohesion between member states at a time when we're discussing matters with China, the US and the Russian Federation, when they are externally making the EU situation vulnerable. I'm also referring to a member state which is, or member states which do not sign up for the single currency, even though that's a treaty requirement. And I'm also thinking of the story which started but has never been clarified of establishing a European army, or the need to ensure compatibility between the armaments industries of the EU member states. And last but not least, I'm also thinking of the lack of boldness, and the speaker has lost his microphone.
I'm sorry, your time is up. I'd like to ask members to respect their speaking time. Thank you. 2 minutes, Mrs. Arena, on behalf of the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament.
Thank you. Since 1950, the Indian Constitution has given a particular arrangement to Jammu and Kashmir. Article 370 gave this area a particularly wide margin of manoeuvre and made the administration of it particular. Foreign affairs was one of only 2 areas which were done by Delhi. The rest was under a local administrative council. And Article 370 also gave the federated states a particular status. Now, since the 5th of August, the date on which the autonomous status of Kashmir was revoked by India, more than 300 people have been arrested on an arbitrary basis. And all types of communication, internet, etc., have been suspended. Emergency services, hospitals, etc., have run out of material and staff. Foreign journalists, NGOs have no longer access to the territory, and the urgent situation is deteriorating with quarantines, and thousands of soldiers have been sent into the area, which is one of the most militarized in the world, with more than 1 million soldiers on that territory. The United Nations report published in 2018 and 2019 pointed to serious human rights violations with regard to civil population, displacements, rapes, and these rapes in particular were committed by the Indian forces and the Pakistani forces. The unilateral decision by the Indian Prime Minister of the 5th of August only makes this situation more dangerous. It's already a tender keg, and Europe cannot stand by. Must help to set up an international inquiry which is independent and transparent into these violations in Kashmir. Europe must weigh in heavily and ensure that the autonomous status that since 1915 has applied is re-upheld, and the United Nations must help to re-establish dialogue between India and Pakistan, because it's only via dialogue that the solution will be found.
Thank you, Mrs. Arena. I would like to ask speakers, for the sake of translation, to speak more slowly. Thank you. Now 2 minutes, Mr. Mohammed, on behalf of the Renew Europe group.
Thank you. I'd like to start by declaring an interest that actually I was born in Kashmir and I moved to the United Kingdom at the age of 4. However, it pains me to see what's happening in Kashmir. Kashmir is in crisis, an international and a human rights crisis. The people of Kashmir have suffered and continue to suffer. The EU is an organisation which proudly stands for human rights right across the world, and we must now today stand with the people of Kashmir. The ongoing crisis in Kashmir threatens the peace and security of the wider region, one of the most volatile in the world. It's our responsibility to do something. The recommendations of the UN Human Rights Commission offer a good starting point for their actions. We must support them and implement the findings of their reports that they published last year in June and this year in July. The institutions of the EU and their member states exist not to only protect the human rights of citizens in the European Union, but also they must be defenders of human rights across the globe. The situation in Kashmir will not improve by trying to blame either side, because all the while people will try to apportion blame. The people of Kashmir are suffering and deserve better. The people of Kashmir should be the ones who decide their fate and their future. Self-determination and upholding human rights are fundamental values in our European Union, and we should demand no less from others around the world, particularly those that want to trade and have relationships with us. The fighting in Kashmir has been going on for decades, but in the end, the crisis is going to be ended only when people sit down at the table and talk. The EU can be a natural facilitator in this role, and that allows both sides to talk. The people of Kashmir are crying out in the darkness. The EU must help and provide a light in that darkness. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed. 1 minute on behalf of the group of the Greens European Free Alliance, Mrs. Dowding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be brief. Reports of serious human rights violations have been coming out of Kashmir for more than a month now. The accounts of raids, arrests, clashes and unlawful detentions are truly appalling. And all of this while mobile phone networks are still largely under lockdown. We UK Green MEPs demand that these human rights violations stop, not only for the sake of the population of Kashmir, but also for the hundreds of thousands of British citizens who are of Kashmiri origin. No peaceful resolution to the Kashmir conflict is conceivable while these abuses continue. We demand that the Indian authorities restore the basic freedoms of the Kashmiri population, and we urge continued EU attention to this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Dowding. On behalf of the Identity and Democracy Group, Mr. Zimniok, 1 minute.
Meine Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, President, the EU wishes and should contribute to resolving the Kashmir conflict, which has been going on for 70 years and has got bogged down, caused conflict and resulted in countless dead with terrorist attacks, reprisals and the like. However, the EU cannot solve this problem. It can only be solved by the parties to the conflict themselves. We, standing outside, can only support that process as a neutral broker. Reading the press, it seems that members of this House are parti pris and even are demanding boycott measures against India, making themselves therefore part of the problem and not being a broker anymore. And I can only say from experience that that doesn't work. As soon as we line up with one side, whether it's the Indian or the Pakistan side, we lose our repute as an honest broker, and all our efforts to resolve the conflict run into the sand and can be easily countered.
Thank you, Mr. Tsimniak. On behalf of the European Conservatives and Reformists Group, Mr. van Orden, 1 minute.
Kashmir is one of the most beautiful areas of India, and with security and stability could be so enormously prosperous. But for over 70 years, it has had an unsettled status and has been under threat, afflicted by externally sponsored terrorism and extremism, and at last there is an opportunity to rectify this situation. Legally, the whole territory should have been part of India from the start, and instead it was invaded and partly occupied by Pakistan, which then allowed its special services to support subversion and terrorism, costing thousands of lives across the line of control into India. Tourism dried up, the economy was put in jeopardy. Under the temporary Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, people lived under different locally imposed rules. Now the changes brought in by Prime Minister Modi will give the same rights to the people of Kashmir as those in the rest of India. And we should look at what's happening in Pakistan if we really want to see abuse of rights, women, religious minorities and transgender people. And all the difficulties that they face in that country. Our governments and the European Union support dialogue and constructive engagement between India and Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a blue card request from Mr. Martuchello. Do you accept the question? Yeah, blue card question. I didn't hear him. Okay.
Sì, grazie. Io sono d'accordo.
Thank you. I agree with what was said by our colleague. But I wonder whether you've read that Pakistan has threatened to use nuclear arms. That's a source of real concern to Europe. Resorting to nuclear arms on the part of Pakistan, and above all the fact that Pakistan, as we can see from history in recent years, is somewhere where terrorists have been able to prepare bloody terrorist attacks in Europe, without mentioning all the tremendous violations of human rights in Pakistan.
Thank you for the question, Mr. van Orden. Your microphone is not on.
Pakistan has been a source of nuclear proliferation. It has given sanctuary to terrorist organizations and terrorist leaders, and it promotes terrorism across the border, across the line of control into India. Yes, we are talking about two nuclear-armed states, but I don't think that is relevant to this particular matter at this time. If the European Union wants to be helpful, it should not be carping. The High Representative should listen more closely to Foreign Minister Jaishankar and what he had to say, because you're getting a very distorted picture from the contributions we've heard in this Parliament so far.
Thank you. On behalf of the Confederal Group of the European United Left, Nordic Green Left, Mrs. Villanueva Ruiz, 1 minute.
No podemos encuadrar.
We cannot frame what's happening in Kashmir as part of a conflict between Pakistan and India. It's because of the actions of Modi, just like Bolsonaro. He's another reactionary leader who started his term in office by restricting public freedoms. So Europe cannot carry on with policy as usual. We need a different, open, human rights-based approach, making bilateral relations subject to that. So the strategic agreement must address human rights in Kashmir. We need to work out a peaceful solution to the conflict between India and Pakistan. Otherwise, Kashmir will be a further example of the limits to European willpower. We need today to define what kind of player we want to be on the international stage. we think Europe needs to be independent. It must have a free hand and be in a position to hold dialogue on the basis of equality, on the basis of multilateral governance, and deal with all the major players.
Mrs. Villanueva Ruiz. On behalf of, I apologize, for non-attached, Mr. Uhrik.
Dear colleagues, since this is an issue of foreign policy, I'm going to speak in English. Many of you are talking about violation of human rights and some other bad things happening in Indian state, Jammu and Kashmir. However, we are, once again, relying only on a secondary information because no one here really and truly knows what is happening in India. When I had a debate with Indian ambassador in Slovak Republic, I asked him how many times the Indian parliament interfered or condemned any European country for its internal policy. It never happened, and we should do the same. We should respect the sovereignty of India because it's not our task to interfere in internal affairs of countries 6,000 kilometers away. We are here to solve the problems of Europe, so please, let's do that.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Corbett.
Thank you. Let me also declare an interest in that I visited Azad Kashmir last month. Mr. President, the unilateral action by India, revoking the autonomy that it granted to the part of Kashmir that it controlled, splitting the territory into two, sending in thousands of extra troops, instituting a media shutdown, arresting many local politicians, that has inflamed an already volatile situation. This conflict has gone on for nearly 70 years now. It cannot be in India's interest that it continues. It costs India a fortune. It's a stain on its international reputation. It's time to press for a solution. But frankly, there is only one viable, long-term and peaceful solution. That is the self-determination of the people of Kashmir. That is what the United Nations laid down in 1947 when India took the dispute to the United Nations Security Council. It's time to implement that, and the EU should use the combined diplomatic leverage of its 28 countries and its own powers on trade and so on to press for that outcome. It's not too late. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Bennion.
Down. Yeah, it's on. Yes, Kashmir joined India only on the condition that it retained its autonomy, and this included a clause denying India the right to change that arrangement unilaterally. Now, the Indian Supreme Court has upheld this principle in previous judgments, and it's interesting that opposition politician Shashi Tharoor today has described the actions of the Indian government as unconstitutional. Now, I do not deny that there has been terrorist problems, and that has provoked some action. And in Geneva last week, I took the trouble to discuss this with Pakistani Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi and asked him that Pakistan do more to clamp down on insurgents. Now, others have described the situation on the ground, and I think it's important to know that I've actually been discussing this with people who were in Srinagar at the time. What should happen now? Well, the curfew should be lifted, the Kashmiri regional government reinstated, and political prisoners released, and UN observers should be allowed access. For the long term, we do call on Pakistan and India to agree on an independent mediator to facilitate talks that includes Kashmiri people from both sides of the line of control. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Timniak requested a blue card question. Do you accept? Yeah, your microphone is not on, Mr. Tim.
I'd just like to ask, when you've got autonomy, well, this is a country that is dependent on the community. They've got nothing, economically speaking, to offer, and so they have to be under India or Pakistan or part and part. The Kashmiris themselves would not want this solution. I myself was for 4 years working as a diplomat, and I think I was in the region many, many times, and I don't think you'd find a majority for that anywhere, anytime.
Thank you. Please answer the question.
Certainly, we don't know whether there would be a majority because it hasn't been tested. But I think the assertions that this is a very undeveloped and backward area. Now, despite the fact that this has been an area of conflict for 70 years, and we know that conflict actually does depress the economy, if you actually look at the indicators, and I've actually looked at the indicators, on virtually every indicator in terms of well-being, incomes, literacy, virtually every indicator you can think of, Kashmir comes out better than the rest of India and one of the top areas of India.
1 minute, Mr. Buchner.
In reports on Kashmir, the massive violations of human rights are often not a feature, and they're perpetrated by both sides, by Pakistan and by India. That's not right. But we're also on the verge of a war between these two nuclear powers. And I think there's only one way in which such a war and such violations of human rights can be prevented, and that is the implementation of the UN resolution on this topic. It may look a little optimistic as I see it, but I don't think we can allow things to run the course that they're running, and that means that the UN must step in. If need be, they must also send a peace mission to the area, in agreement with both sides in this very tense area, but that's the only solution, and we cannot allow things to continue on this path. So I would ask the High Representative to step in with great urgency. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mrs. Sardone.
The situation in Kashmir was bad before. There have been known episodes of violence over the years. I think this discussion is a bit imbalanced. I don't think we should be speaking against or in favour of either side. We're talking about a part of the world where for time there have been terrorist groups linked to Islamist extremism, where there is radicalisation underway on a very worrying scale. In these areas, ISIS flags have been seen, and there has been violence, sadly, for too long. I think we need to analyse the historic context based on really authoritative historical sources and examine who really is supporting terrorism. In the 90s, hundreds and thousands of Indians left the region because of violence. What are we doing to discuss the very many victims of terrorism or the Islamist teachings supported by Pakistan? We need to support security arrangements that protect people against terrorist violence. Thank you.
Thank you. As we are running late, I am not going to accept blue card questions from those who have already spoken and asked a blue card question already as well. 1 minute, Mrs. Mubarak.
We in the European Parliament uphold the principles as enshrined in the treaties. Therefore, I am ashamed by the lack of resolution on Kashmir. There will always be those who will support India in deflecting the world's attention away from its shortcomings to place blame on others, their perceived foes. But on this occasion, India alone is responsible for revoking Article 370 and of the current deplorable, bellicose and destructive situation in Kashmir. If we profess our belief in human rights and religious freedom, then why are we silent? And the most fundamental right, the right to self-determination, has been denied to the Kashmiris for more than 70 years. How long do we stay silent? How bad does it have to get? Let us put aside our apathy or indeed our eagerness to conclude an FTA and examine our conscience. Democratic principles, peace and stability are ultimately in the interests of India too.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mrs. Gill.
To those members who've spoken today of their indignation towards India, I'm astonished by your partiality, oversight and lack of any real empathy with the Kashmiris. Why do I say partial? When Pakistan took the same measures in Gilgit and Baltistan, we didn't speak up. When they gave away territory, which wasn't theirs, to China, we didn't speak up. Or when Sikh and other minority women are abducted and forced to convert, we don't speak up. The fact is there are human rights violations in POK and very many honourable colleagues look the other way. Let me be clear, the solution to Kashmir is not going to be found in this chamber. The solution to Kashmir will come when state-sponsored terrorism and global misinformation by Pakistan ends. Then dialogue will follow. Pakistan may talk the talk, but it does not walk the walk when it comes to human rights. And it beggars belief that it has GSP+. And I say to those colleagues concerned about resenting of Article 370, you focus on one part and ignore the other issues that are dear to the hearts of many of us. Not only will it improve the rights of LGBT, women, minorities, it will also improve environmental protections amongst others and ban the outrageous triple talaq divorce. So why shouldn't Kashmiris have less rights than those enjoyed by Indians elsewhere? Thank you.
And I'd like to again ask members to adhere to their speaking time. 2 minutes, Mrs. Le Breton. Oh, sorry, Mr. Le Breton. I apologize.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi decided to revoke on the 5th of August the autonomous status of Kashmir. That is explained by the fact that the security forces in India have recently been the victims of attacks perpetrated by Islamist groups in Kashmir, which has been claimed by Pakistan since forever. Pakistan has since the accession of Imran Khan, supported by the Islamist parties, adopted more than kind perception of the Indian government, but Narendra Modi's act shows that he's prepared to fight Islamist terrorism and bring the Pakistani authorities to face to face with their responsibilities in that regard. In Pakistan, demonstrations were organized by a range of Islamist organizations to protest against the decision by the Indian government. Kashmir, let's not forget, is a region part of the India, and we're surprised once again to hear the UN Secretary General stigmatizing the position of India on that. Whereas this country, many times itself victim of terrorism in Kashmir and elsewhere in its territory, such as in Mumbai in 2008, has never had any support in those times where it has had to face the Islamist peril. As our colleague Thierry Marigny recalled in AFET, Kashmir is Indian, and the question, therefore, as to Kashmir is for the Indian side and for nobody else. And let's not think that Brussels can pursue any role in pursuing the dialectics of Pakistan.
Czarnecki.
President, ladies and gentlemen, let's remind ourselves that India is the greatest democracy of the world. And in the context of our democracy, I would say that it's our probably the only one ally in this part of Asia. And I believe we need to take a broader view. We need to look at terrorist acts that took place also in India and in Jammu and in Kashmir. And these terrorists, they didn't land it from the moon. They were coming from the neighboring country. We should see it against this background, and we as European democracy should support democratic India. I don't like this kind of assessment of India that we are hearing here. And Mr. Corbett, who has just left us, he said what he said as if he didn't remember that over 70 years his country, the United Kingdom, lost India as its colony.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Pisapia.
Grazie, Presidente. Thank you, President. The situation in Kashmir, as in many other places in the world, requires intense diplomatic activity based on international law and respect for human rights. On the one hand, there's a constitutional change adopted by a broad majority in both the upper and lower house. On the other hand, there's a complete failure to consult the citizens of Kashmir. What Nehru said is that we gave our word of honour for a peaceful solution, and that must be honoured. The first UN report on the situation in Kashmir called for a special committee to investigate the violations of human rights on both sides. Human rights are the polar star guiding all activity of the EU. For us in the EU and the European Parliament, we have the duty to work on the basis of our own experience towards a peaceful solution that promotes democracy and peace, and I hope that's the road that we'll walk together.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mrs. Lechante.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Les critiques à l'égard de l'Inde, la plus grande démocratie au monde, entendues dans cet hémicycle, se fondent sur une représentation des faits qui est mystificatrice. On se focalise sur la réforme constitutionnelle, mais on oublie la poussée séparatiste et la question de sécurité. La situation au Jammu et Cachemire s'est aggravée. Une série d'attaques islamistes a eu lieu contre les forces de l'ordre, comme le 14 février quand une voiture piégée a tué 40 policiers, ou le 2 août dernier avec la découverte d'un arsenal qui aurait dû servir pour commettre un attentat contre les milliers de pèlerins hindous qui se rendent chaque année dans la grotte sacrée d'Amarnath. Dans ce cadre, les mesures de sécurité prises par Narendra Modi, le Premier ministre indien, visent à garantir la souveraineté du pays, la protection de ses concitoyens.
The sealing of the border with Pakistan, which has been on America's list of ambiguous countries since 2018 vis-à-vis terrorism, those are the true facts.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mrs. McIntyre.
"43 days ago, the Indian government revoked Articles 370 and 35A of the Indian Constitution, removing at a stroke the guarantee of Jammu and Kashmir's autonomy. We've seen a huge surge in the number of troops deployed there, a total communications blackout, curfews and house arrests. We hear continually of violations of human rights, including the use of shotguns against civilians. Take the case of Azra Ahmed Khan. Despite denials by the Indian government, medical records released by the hospital present clear evidence that he died as a result of a shotgun pellet to the head. I visited Azad Kashmir last year and heard accounts of even infants being fired at with shotguns. There can never, ever be any excuse for killing and maiming and blinding small children. I really cannot understand why a great nation like India, which prides itself on the strength of its democracy, behaves in this way. India aspires to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Events of the past month are not the actions of a credible candidate.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Damija.
India is the largest functioning democracy in the world. There are 200 million Muslims who live peacefully with others in India. and it's also a member of the G20. Now, there are two Supreme Court actions going on: the continued stopping of mobile and internet services in 7% of Jammu and Kashmir, and the setting aside of Article 370 and 35A. The EU does not want to appear neo-colonial on matters that are sub judice. The Indian Supreme Court is independent and does a really good job. Now, according to Indians, there are 40 new laws that will now apply to Kashmiris: ban on triple talaq divorce, that is terrible for women; prohibition of child marriage; protection of women by domestic violence. Are these not human rights? And there are 40 of them. So please look at the other side. There was a mention of the UN plebiscite that they asked for in 1947. I have a video to show the US State Department why this plebiscite didn't happen: because the Pakistani troops wouldn't move back from the line of control. Thank you.
Now, catch the eye. Mr. Gade.
Over the last 50 years, the area has been plagued by instability, and much of the progress in India towards a modern democracy in India has not been followed in Kashmir under the special status, particularly in independent rule of law, protection of minorities, including sexual minorities, the education of children, and the securing of fundamental rights for women. India, for years, has spent money in the area for years, been stolen by an elite, and has not ended up helping the poor local population. So the population has not really benefited over all of this time, and it is incumbent on this House and that we uphold fundamental rights, and we look at the positive sides of things for Kashmiri population and for women and minorities.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Lopez.
We debate flagrant violations of human rights in parts of the world where there's never been democracy or any trace of it. That is not the case in India. As the point has been made, this is a constitutional democracy. Its constitution goes back to 1950, and it's based on the largest democracy in the world. It's a very diverse, complex federal state, and the coexistence of various minorities has been a success. That includes a Muslim minority in a country with other religions. The instance of Jammu and Kashmir, in my view, is something on which the European Parliament would be well advised to be cautious and reserved, where the Constitution, Article 370, provides for the suspension of autonomy. This is an important step to prevent the radicalization of the Islamist movement, which has been growing within the extremely complex situation in India. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Davies.
Thank you, President. I really welcome the words of the Minister in her introductory remarks. We know we have a divided House, but I think the position taken by the High Representative in expressing concern for human rights is the right balance. India is a great country, a great democracy, but you can't ignore the fact that Kashmir is a disputed territory, recognised as such by the United Nations. It's effectively been under military occupation, with an army that's been allowed to maim and murder without any proper supervision or jurisdiction. And communication bans, loss of any sort of sense of self-determination must feed a sense of injustice in Kashmir. It is because we are friends of India that we have to ask this great democracy, which we know where Prime Minister Modi has the support of his country. He knows there is majority support for the actions he's taken. But we have to question whether this is the right course of action and whether it will result in positive benefits. So I have to ask the Minister, words have been very good. Will there be any actions to follow them up?
Thank you. I'd like to remind members that the Catch the Eye procedure is for members who haven't been on the speakers list. And Mrs. Gill, you have already spoken even more than what your original speaking time was. So I will now give the floor to Minister Tuppurainen again, who will again speak on behalf of the Vice President of the Commission, High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. Minister Tuppurainen, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, honourable members, allow me to say that this exchange of views was very useful and very timely. I would like to take this opportunity to thank honourable members for their interventions, comments and suggestions. Now, I can only conclude that the EU will continue to monitor closely the situation with our key focus being on de-escalating the situation involving two nuclear powers. We must make every effort needed to avoid an escalation of the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Tuppurainen, and thank you for coming to the Parliament, especially in this very late time in the